Linux Luddites, episode 90 for the 31st of October 2016. Hello, and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Paddy.
And I'm Jesse. Now, hang on a minute. Let me find my trumpet. There it is. Doo-doo-doo-doo! I'd like to have massive congratulations to both Joe and Paddy for making this 3 years of podcasting. For those of you who don't know, because way more than half our audience has joined since I joined. I only joined in the 20th episode, so I don't get the same accolade, but congratulations to you both. So I know that you're all going to be very British about this and be very quiet, so I'll get on with it.
It's just stunned silence, mate. That's all it is.
On this show, we have a chat about Raspberry Pis in our lives, mainly to force Paddy into actually using his. And then we have your feedback. And after that, Paddy gets his own back by setting us an OAP. But first, we, of course, have the news.
Well, first up is that Canonical have announced the Canonical Live Patch service, which is a way to patch the kernel in Ubuntu 16.04 without having to reboot, which is something that we've heard before from various other distros, and now Ubuntu is joining that list. But it's only available for the 64-bit version, which kind of makes sense, the x86 64. And it is a kind of half-paid service, half-free. If you pay, I think it's 12 quid a month, then you can get unlimited access to this. And if you don't pay, you still have to sign up, but it's free. And you can do it for 3 of your machines at once. Which, now, I don't know. I don't want to be negative straight away on this. So let's be positive that they have not invented too much themselves. They've done it with technology that already exists in the kernel. But there are a couple of things that I think are not great about this. The first one is I don't think that you should be live patching your kernel in the first place. And I think you agree with me on that one, Paddy, don't you?
Yeah, I think this topic's come up a few times over the years, hasn't it?
Yeah, if uptime is that critical, then surely you should have redundant servers that you can instantly switch over to while you update this one. Because if you do several years, say, of these live patches without testing a reboot, what's to say when the power goes out and then your redundant backup power also goes out, that then when you reboot the server, something hasn't gone horribly wrong and it won't come up? I mean, whenever I do updates that require a reboot, I immediately do that because I'd rather deal with it now than at some abstract point down the road where I don't know what I've done to change it.
This is actually strangely pertinent for me because with the upgrade from 1404 to 1604 from LTS to LTS on my server, it obviously went from using Upstart to using Systemd. And every time I SSH'd in, it said, you need to restart, and I just ignored it. I'll do that tomorrow. And eventually I got around to doing it. And a whole load of the services that I have auto-starting didn't auto-start because Systemd uses, different scripts and the service starting and things like this. And that was just that one change. So had it been more significant than that, and like you say, a number of things that had been either changed within the kernel or that had made some sort of fundamental difference that you would normally have to restart for, it would be problematic to pin down exactly which one it is that made that problem. And now you touched on the fact that it's free for the community. You can get, I think it's 3 PCs that without having to pay for it. And they're sort of using the community as a bit of a testing ground, aren't they? So they'll try new things, and then if everything goes well and there's not many issues that come out of it, they'll then release it to the paid service.
Which is fair enough, really. And I think it's quite a good idea because it's a good idea to have these canary testers. So you roll out these kernel patches to a few users, and then a few more, and then a few more, and then once you've kind of proven that it's all well and good, then you roll it out to everyone. But I don't know, I think you might be over-egging the pudding with your System D stuff, because that was a major, major change. Whereas we're not talking about massive changes here. We're talking about security updates, because it's only going to be critical patches that are delivered this way. And so you're not talking about a whole new kernel, a whole new init system or anything like that. You're just talking about a few changes to the kernel. So I think that it's not going to be as different, but it's still a good idea if you patch your kernel to reboot, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with you, as we've talked about before. You said you've got 2 issues with this. What's the second one?
Well, if you carefully read the blog post by Dustin Kirkland, you'll see that some of it is open source, but some of it perhaps not.
Yeah, Canonical are no strangers to having proprietary solutions at the back end, are they?
Well, seemingly not, no. But it's a little bit disappointing, really. I mean, I know it's a kind of commercial service, but at the same time, they have built their business on open source, and it would be nice if they open sourced it before they abandoned it, like they did with Ubuntu 1, which took them about 18 months, but they did in the end. So, yeah. And it's funny that he he doesn't say proprietary, he says it's commercial software. And it just made me think of RMS going, wait, you said commercial software, which is not necessarily proprietary. But I think the implication is quite strong here that it is.
I think the situation's a bit different, though, from Ubuntu 1, because at least there was a product someone could pick up and do something with. I mean, unless you are a kernel dev, you aren't going to be able to go in and roll your own kernel live patches, are you?
Well, almost definitely not, but it's still, I don't know, it rubs me the wrong way that there's something proprietary that they're using.
Well, before we end up going down a very deep rat hole here, Jesse, why might people be interested in live patching their kernels?
You're touching there on this serious Linux exploit. So for about 9 years, there's been a kernel exploit which allows privilege escalation, and it's only just been found, but they have, now that it's been found, some security experts have looked around to try and see if there's evidence of it being used in the wild, and they have in fact found that. And the problem is that it's not very difficult to make these exploits work reliably for this particular kernel issue. So obviously the upstream kernel developers have been doing their best to make a patch for it. That's now been released. Downstream distributions are now patching those. But until people do a kernel update and originally would require a full restart of the system, now with the previous story, you should in theory be able to just patch that one bit and carry on with your uptime. So, I mean, there's, this is one of the pros, but as Joe points out, in the previous story, there are a lot of cons for live patching.
Yeah, no, Ubuntu have actually pushed out a live patch for this already.
So does that mean that anyone with 1604 could, in theory, use that patch now? Or do you need a particular version of Ubuntu or a particular addition to the kernel to allow the live patching to happen?
Need a particular addition, is my understanding. They are separately developed packages that you require, so you can't just go and suck it down and do it yourself.
Okay, but I mean, the thing that got me about this was the fact that this vulnerability has been around for like 9 years, and it's something that's in a very core part of the kernel, so nearly every version of Linux has it, and therefore, everyone, RHEL and Ubuntu and SUSE and things like this, are all scrambling to get this into their kernels. But it just seems like a really long time to have an exploit that hasn't been found.
We'd think that, and Jonathan Corbett from LWN looked at a lifetime of kernel bugs way back in 2010 and found that they're typically about 5 years for them to surface and people to realise they're there and deal with them. And Case Cook, who we've spoken about on the show previously, has recently repeated that exercise. And he's discovered that little's really changed over that time, and bugs categorised as critical have been existing for around just over 5 years. And that was once it included the dirty cow thing you were talking about a moment ago, Jesse. And those ranging from high to low, similarly not being found and patched between 5 and 6 years.
Is the problem here that the kernel is just so esoteric that there are just too few people looking for these bugs and physically and technically capable of fixing them?
I think that's one of the issues, and it's a broader issue in our world. We've always sort of gone about many eyeballs, but we've seen time and time again that isn't actually a factual statement. People don't look at other people's code, or if they do, they haven't got the domain expertise to be able to identify whether there are actually issues there. I mean, Cook's main contention in the piece that he wrote is that since this is the pattern for the bugs that we actually know about, it's also a fair assumption, and I would agree with him, that there are other similar bugs sort of hiding in the kernel there, just waiting to be found in a few years' time. So it's not as if these are the outliers, we found them all 5 years, yet it's a horrendous length of time, but they're sorted now. In another 5 years, something from today can pop out.
Yeah, there's a great graph in his piece that shows when the bug was in the kernel, and which version of the kernel it was in, and then when it was eventually found. And so a lot of them, I mean, the graph only starts from kernel version 2.6, and a lot of them are in there at that stage, and then, as you say, an average of 5 years later, they get fixed or what have you. But there are also a lot which start at version 2.6.23 or 2.6.39 or whatever it may be. So absolutely, as you're saying, it's just that these are the ones we know about, whereas if someone adds some new feature to the kernel, who's to say that in collaboration with the piece that's already in there, you know, they don't sort of, I'm not saying work together, but negatively work together to produce something that could be exploited.
Yeah, which kind of goes back to what you were saying, Joe, about complexity and the sheer amount of churn there is in kernel code. I think means we'll never get away from that. I've got to say this is one of the areas I disagree with Rob Langley on. I share his views on public domain software quite vociferously, but from the kernel point of view, when you're looking at a monolithic kernel like this with this amount of churn, there is just no way to get rid of this sort of vast array of bugs being introduced all the time and then subsequently found years and years later. And the only way to actually approach the issue is to look at things like microkernels, which I know Rob's quite sniffy about.
But historically, they haven't done very well, have they? Microkernels. I mean, look at the herd.
Yeah, or you could look at QNX, which BlackBerry use quite happily, or L4, which is in modem chips in probably the mobile phone in your hand at the moment. I realise it's a different domain they're targeting there, but the hardware is certainly capable of running things at a fast enough lick these days. It's the software that's holding things back, and I think we'll talk about this a bit later in the show.
Okay, well, let's keep it on the subject of bugs, or is it a glitch? I saw you tweeting about this week, Paddy. This is a hardware issue, let's call it that. We reported on this quite a long time ago, I seem to recall, Rowhammer, which is rather complicated, and so I don't fully understand the technicalities of it, but my understanding is that if you get susceptible RAM and CPU combinations and basically hammer that RAM with the correct software, you can make bits flip, so you can turn a 0 into a 1 and vice versa. And if you are incredibly clever and write incredibly good software or targeted software, you can take advantage of that. And we talked about that in a kind of theoretical sense before. And it seems that after a few months of trying, now it is possible to root Android phones using this Rowhammer exploit or issue. And there's not really a simple way around it because of its nature of being hardware-based. It's not like you can just quickly patch a bit of software and fix it. And getting root access to an Android phone is something that a lot of people want to be able to do. But then again, it's also a vulnerability. If you've got a phone that isn't supposed to be rooted according to the manufacturer and then you root it, then that opens up a hornet's nest of security issues. So there are various software fixes in the works, but it seems that none of them are really going to be 100% foolproof.
Yeah, one of the solutions that Google have released just makes it a lot more difficult. It puts up a number of more hurdles, or at least slows down the process of doing this hammering. And so the process of getting into the phone takes a lot longer. But it does still mean there is a hole there. You haven't actually changed the chip, you haven't changed the RAM that this happens to. There's some report about which phones do and don't have this exploit issue, however we're calling it, and that's because some of them will have one particular chip and some of them have other chips which don't seem to be susceptible. And even in the same type of phone, a later version may have been using a different piece of hardware or component of hardware and therefore not being susceptible.
Tell you one thing that slightly disappointed me is this news came out, well, it was over a week ago now, I think, and the researchers who'd done the work on it have got an app they were planning to release so you can actually test your own phone's vulnerability. And that still isn't up in the Play Store. So it looks to me very much as if Google are keeping it out of the Play Store, presumably to avoid any bad publicity there. That does seem quite disappointing if that's what's going on.
But there's an APK available, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you can sideload one, but I mean, you wouldn't, would you?
I wouldn't be inclined, I must say.
Yeah, and as you both suggested, I mean, hardware is the root of the issue here, and that's really where the solution's going to come from. I mean, I saw a nice quote from Linus earlier this morning, just when I was going back through these stories, and he was saying, quote, "There is nothing remotely sane you can do in software to actually fix this," unquote. So whilst there are solutions being proposed on the kernel mailing list at the moment to do with mitigating this, I think he's probably right. It is a hardware issue at the end of the day.
Well, on the topic of hardware, on the last show we were talking about the Pixel and Joe's issue with the fact that it was quite an expensive item. So the numbers I've got are in dollars, so that's $770 for an unsubsidized phone. But there's been a breakdown that looks at what all the various components cost, and it looks like to actually manufacture the Pixel is $285.
That's the XL, isn't it? The larger one, the more expensive one.
Yep. So they've gone for the top of the range, get the biggest price, and that's $278 worth of actual hardware plus about $8 for sort of the manufacturing, paying someone to put it together. And what they're saying is that the hardware cost is very similar to an iPhone 7 or a Galaxy 7, and the price at sale is very similar to those two devices as well. So it really does look like Google are pitching their pricing at pretty much the same as, you know, their big competitors.
Yeah, what I found interesting here was it's not the pricing so much as the markup they're pitching to be the same. And it's a huge markup, isn't it?
Yeah, you're looking at about, roughly $500. So that's, 200%, 300%? Oh.
Yeah, but something's got to pay for all those adverts on that television thing that you lot watch, which I hear they have been doing. And there's been adverts all over YouTube, which I suppose would be free anyway. But they've really marketed this, haven't they, like a Samsung phone. It's not like with the Nexus phones where, as far as I know, there wasn't any advertising, was there? It was all just sort of word of mouth, tech blogs, YouTube reviews, that sort of thing. And it was just people in the know. Or they would maybe advertise them on Google's homepage, that sort of thing, stuff they can do for free. But I mean, they've really gone for this high-end consumer Apple, Samsung kind of market now, haven't they?
That's interesting because I haven't actually seen any, but I mean, I don't watch a great deal of television. I obviously run ad blockers on my PC, but it's interesting if they're going down that route.
There's an awful lot of billboards and posters and things with it on around here, that's for sure.
Oh, well, billboards don't stay up very long around here. We have to rip them down to burn them to keep us warm. Going back to the costs just briefly, it is a big markup, and I know people will justify it in terms of intellectual property and design costs and what have you. But when you're looking at devices like this that are so powerful, why do you think they're just going to throw it out the door next year and bring another model out? When you are looking at something this good, why can they not support it for the next 3-5 years without changing it?
Because that's not an economically viable business model, is it? They need to sell you new stuff all the time to keep making money.
Yeah, it was clearly a rhetorical question, but hopefully one that you took a point from.
Yeah.
But the difference slightly with Google is that they're selling you a product that has loads of Google stuff inside it, and they are, coordinating the whole package now from the hardware through the software and the apps. And so you're supposed to be, well and truly in the Google sphere, and they make their money off of the advertising and knowing about you and where you are and all these sorts of things. But that's not the same for Samsung. That's not quite the same for Apple. Maybe it is the same for Apple now I think about it. But with Samsung, you can understand how they have a huge markup and they are trying to get you to buy a new phone every 2 years because they're just selling the hardware and a couple of apps. So I can sort of see Samsung's defense because they are trying to shift hardware. Yep. But from Google's point of view, they're trying to shift a piece of hardware, and once you have that in your hand, the longer you hold on to it and don't drop it and go to someone else, the better for them. So I sort of agree with Paddy. They should be considering having this as a long-term strategy to have support for more than a couple of years.
Yeah, because all the software that's inside it, all the services that are inside it, aren't inside the phone in the first place, are they? So as long as the phone's fast enough to connect to the web and access those cloud-based services, it's a good one.
Yeah, and it's also outrageous that they will sell something and then abandon it 18 months later. But that's a whole different story that we've gone on and on about many times before, including the Remix Mini that we bought and has been abandoned.
Yeah, it appears so, doesn't it? Jide, the company behind Remix, though, is back with another Kickstarter, and it's a fancier box this time. And they've already blown through their target, which was $250,000, and are currently sat on around $500,000 pledged, and there's still 3 weeks to go as we're recording.
Yeah, and they keep sending me messages because it was me who actually bought it. They keep sending me messages about this new cool thing. It's like, well, you've abandoned the old thing. I'm not going to buy your new thing.
The new thing's a lot more shiny, Joe.
Well, the new thing, I just don't see it really. I mean, it's targeted as a TV box experience, and the market for that is flooded with these little Android boxes and these Kodi boxes that are all essentially the same thing, a little ARM-based machine that you plug into your telly and have some sort of remote. The whole point of Remix was the desktop interface.
Yeah, which this box does have, as well as an Android TV interface, so it offers the two options there. I think it's slightly more high-end than a lot of the boxes that are out there. I mean, it's an octa-core with 2 gigs of RAM and 16 of storage, and the usual Ethernet, USB and HDMI ports, and it's supposed to support 4K at 60 frames per second. And as far as I could tell, it's very much in line specs-wise with the NVIDIA Shield TV device, but it's about half the price. And you also do get to run a proper desktop Android on it, so you don't get a controller, which I think the Shield comes with, but other than that, for half the money, I don't think it's a bad comparison at all.
Oh, well, with that in mind, I suppose it's a lot more attractive if you want something like that. And the 4K support is very good because, I mean, I don't have a machine that could support 4K, even if I could afford to buy a screen that was 4K. So for that kind of price that we're talking about here, that I suppose is quite attractive.
Yeah, which we haven't mentioned. It's $99 on Kickstarter at the moment.
Yeah, which I suppose seems reasonable. I mean, especially if that's half the price of an NVIDIA Shield TV box. But I don't know, just with their typical Android OEM attitude of abandon the old thing and sell a new thing, I feel like they've let me down.
Yeah, well, don't go down that hole either, because we'll come back to that in 2 or 3 stories' time.
Yeah, okay, well, let's move on and talk about the BBC Microbit then. And it's going global, or at least they're going to try. It was given out to about 1 million school children in the UK earlier this year, and then they started selling it in the UK for £13. And now it's going to be available internationally. And they're trying to kind of make it an educational standard worldwide by the looks of things. And more importantly, they've established the Microbit Educational Foundation. And as part of that non-profit, they are releasing finally the hardware specs to it so anyone can make their own. So it's properly open hardware now, which is excellent news.
Yeah, these should sell fairly well in other countries that don't have something similar. But because it's open software and now open hardware, it means that in Germany, they've actually made a sort of clone of the BBC Microbit but tweaked it a little bit. And so it's called the Calliope Mini, and it's very similar to the Microbit. It's got the little LEDs that you can have lighting up in certain patterns or what have you, depending on what you're using it for. But it's a star shape, and it means that the 6 pins that you put crocodile clips on are further apart. They're at the end of each of the stars. And it also has addition of a microphone and speaker, an I2C connector, and a motor driver. So if you get the correct motor, you can hook that straight up. So it's got a little bit more functionality, and this is going to be released in Germany in a similar way that the BBC Microbit was released in the UK.
Yeah, I must say this looks more attractive to me. As you say, being this star shape and having the contacts much more spread out means that it's less likely for you to get shorts and stuff like that. And having the mic and the speaker and stuff makes it more feature rich. No word on price yet, though. So if it's going to be horribly expensive, then it doesn't make much sense. But if they can do it for about the same price as the Microbit, then I can see this kind of taking over, really.
But it does make me realise that perhaps one of the features of the Microbit hasn't really taken off was the whole point of having the main 5 or 6 connectors at the bottom was that if you wanted to slot it into like a bigger board, if it was to be a daughter board, then it had all these other smaller ones next to it, so you could have sort of 15 connections rather than the basic 6 or however many more there were. And so clearly the Germans have realised that that's not a feature that's particularly well used, and actually having just these 6, which are further apart and therefore less likely to short, as you pointed out, is a better feature for kids who just want to get involved with it.
Well, I have seen some prototypes, at least, of boards that the microbit plugs into, albeit I haven't seen anything mainstream. So, yeah, maybe that's not going to take off.
But maybe like the Raspberry Pi is, very popular amongst the hacker community globally, as far as I can see, and it is one of the, if not the premier devices for that. This may well, the BBC or some sister boards, daughter boards, similar sort of forks and things may well become the standard for teaching kids how to program, in classrooms and things. And it would be really good to have that sort of standard, because then you get some sort of knowledge which is distributable. You can go to other countries with it and they'll know what you've been using and things like this. So there's a good use case for having all the children across, at least Europe or the world, or whatever you, to have that sort of interoperability, if you will.
Well, as you mentioned there, these sort of devices are taking off in a fairly big way, which is something you can't really say about smartwatches. And in the third quarter this year, just 2.7 million smartwatches were shipped, and that compares to around 5.6 million during the same period last year. And whilst Apple's still top of the pile, it's Garmin who've seen a massive increase in sales numbers, and that's pushed them up into second place in the charts.
I didn't even know they made smartwatches.
Well, I'm at the other extreme. I sit in a bay of 8 people at work, and 2 of them have got smartwatches, and they're both Garmin's. And the reason for that is one of them is a mad keen cyclist, and one of them is a mad keen runner. And the ones they've got are these smartwatches. I think they're the same ones. I can't be sure, but the girl I was talking to the other day, hers is a triathlon one, and so it's waterproof as well, and it's got features for switching between, when you're swimming and you do your transfer into running and cycling, what have you. It allows you to do that very quickly, but because it's waterproof and it's made for activities and things like this, it has a much more simple interface that you can use whilst you're running or cycling or things, but also it can connect to the phone. It's got all the normal smartwatch features. And it is interesting, as Paddy pointed out, the fact that you didn't even know they did them, that they're the biggest or the second biggest, not Google, not Motorola. The Moto 360 is talked about a lot, and its successor. So it is odd that it's Garmin who seem to be, running away with it after Apple, who are obviously going to be the leaders because the fanboys have to follow.
I hope that was an intentional pun.
It clearly wasn't, because I was trying to work out what I said.
But surely the issue here is that the people who want a smartwatch have bought one and they're not willing to upgrade it every year.
Well, when I bought my £200 watch, a year later I thought, right, chuck this away, I'll buy my other £200 watch. And then a year later, no. You buy a watch and you have it for ages, and that's kind of it, isn't it? And so the idea that you'd buy, while this is a different type of device, I know it's not just a watch, but the idea that you'd buy one of those and then be tapped on the shoulder to buy one a year later, it's just not going to happen. And in the same way that we see smartphones, they crawl forwards in their improvements and things. They're all so good now that you don't really need a new one every 2 years. The same can be said for smartwatches. They're not increasing in performance or battery life or connectivity in a way that is really that different from one a year or so ago.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting in the actual IDC report, which the numbers came from, that they were suggesting that it's commercial use, sort of use in industry, that they can see being a big market going forwards as opposed to consumers. Because I think you're right on the consumer side of things, that simpler devices, less functional, if you like, devices, make a lot more sense simply because of the form factor.
Well, I've been using the Pebble for a while now, and I don't use any complicated functionality on it. I just use it for notifications. And so, yeah, I don't need anything too fancy, although I have been eyeing a few Android watches just because, well, new toys and all that. But I find it hard to justify it when this Pebble only needs to be charged about once a week, and it is doing what I need it to do. It's giving me my notifications, and it's allowing me to skip my music and change the volume. What else do I need it to do? I apart from all this fitness tracking stuff, but Anyone who's ever met me will know I'm not not madly keen on that kind of thing.
Next year, yeah, Joe.
Yeah, I wonder if they could invent one that tracks how much you drink, although no, I really wouldn't want that either, would I? It'd probably just be depressing.
You'd cheat on it by drinking with your other hand so it didn't record it going up and down.
Yeah, exactly. But let's move on. And Macs are 3 times cheaper to own than Windows PCs, says clickbait headline. Really, this is Fletcher Previn, who is the Vice President of IT at IBM. And he has concluded, rightfully so, I think, that over the lifetime of owning computers in enterprise, it works out more economical to just buy Macs, because even though the initial investment is much, much higher, the support cost is much, much lower because Macs just work. And that tagline that Apple fanboys will always wheel out seems to hold some truth, doesn't it?
Yeah, it looks like from the numbers, about 15% of the PCs in IBM are Macs, but they only actually take up 5% of the support time. So, it's the majority of time is going to be with PCs. And yeah, they're saying
Windows PCs, Macs are PCs, personal computers.
Yes, I can't believe I said that. I had the same argument with this idiot who sits in my bay, and I asked him what he uses at home. He says a Mac. I said, I've got I use Linux. And he looks at me really confusingly and says, do you mean a PC? No, I mean Linux, because you ran a PC as well. So I stepped in the same hole, but we can gloss over that. This is what editing's for. So it says that despite the fact that the Mac hardware is between sort of $100 and $400 more than the Windows PC would be, over those 4 years, they save between $300 and $500. So you multiply that by a company the size of IBM and the cost it must be to have all those support people doing those support tickets, it is going to be a vast amount of money saved. And they are taking into account not only support, but also the fact that you have to buy all of the Windows licenses. And they've said that with those numbers, they're even using conservative Microsoft prices for things like Office and what have you. So they're some of the best prices they've got from Windows for the Office software. And even then, they're saving a huge amount of money.
Interesting that they do have a fair number of Linux machines, although there's no information about how much it costs to support those.
No, that would be interesting to find out. I mean, the numbers were 442,000 Windows boxes, 90,000 Apples, and 72,000 Linux. And apparently they used to have a policy of only using Linux for security and sensitive client work, so that anything you were doing that was really important for the government or of a sensitive nature wouldn't go anywhere near a Windows box, which I thought was quite interesting. But if you watch the video that accompanied the link I'm going to stick in the show notes, right near the end of that, Fletcher talks about how now they've certified the Macs as being suitable for using in sensitive environments as well. So it's just poor old Windows boxes that are out in the cold.
I mean, I know you two have never really used a Mac, have you? But the reality is that if you put a gun to my head and said, right, you're not allowed to use Linux ever again, you've got to pick either OS 10 or Mac OS now or Windows, it's just a no-brainer. Obviously, I hate the fact that it's proprietary, but it is a fairly decent platform. And if it was open source, I would seriously consider using it, I think. I mean, obviously, it's never going to be, so I'm going to continue to use Linux.
Are you swayed partly because the fact that it's very similar to Linux? It's BSD, so it's got terminals and you can run a lot of the same commands and things like this. Whereas going to Windows, you're back into GUIs and things that you're not so familiar with.
I think that's part of it, yeah. Although they are stripping out that Unixy stuff bit by bit, so I hear. But yeah, I mean, the fundamental fact that you can drop to a shell and do more or less the same stuff, there are a few quirks that are different, but ultimately it's very similar. Yeah, I think that is a big attraction. And I think just overall, the design of it, the functionality of it, the stability of it seems to work really well. I mean, presumably that's because it's available on such a limited number of machines that they can do proper QA on it, whereas Windows is available like Linux for pretty much anything. And therefore, it's almost impossible to make sure it's going to work on every hardware configuration. But yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is that if Linux didn't exist and open source didn't exist, I'd probably be an Apple fanboy.
You've got me interested now. I want to ask another question. Is there also a benefit of going to Mac because they have more software that is suitable for musicians and recording and things like this? It's a better platform for that than Windows.
That is a very, very old view of Macs. Macs are better for creative people. My understanding is there are one or two things. I think Logic they stopped making for Windows, but more or less all of the creative stuff is available for both. Simply because of the number of Windows machines out there, it just makes economic sense to support them. Whether or not they run better on a Mac, well, I think OS X or Mac OS runs much better than Windows anyway, so it's a tricky thing to say. But no, I mean, that's not really a huge aspect these days, and hasn't been for an awfully long time.
And the converse doesn't hold true either, because during the video, Fletcher was talking about how there was concerns that a lot of the standard Windows apps that people run weren't available on Macs. But after they'd done all the work, they found that out of about 3,000 applications used throughout IBM, only about 78 of them out of those 3,000 weren't available on Macs, so it wasn't actually a big deal for them.
Well, that's probably enough Windows and Mac talk. Shall we drag it back to Linux and the Linux Foundation? And so as a subpart of the Linux Foundation, they've formed the JavaScript Foundation. Now, the Linux Foundation's sort of goal, their mission statement is to make the world's largest shared technology investment, and you can interpret that how you want. God knows what it means. But as part of that, they're trying to pull together a number of bits of software or vital software for the internet and for people to use their computers. And so obviously JavaScript has become that. It's one of the most popular programming languages, and it's used on numerous open source software projects, and loads of the essential stuff that's on the internet runs on it. So they're sort of trying to make this foundation to allow people to collaborate within the community and have basically sort of a central repository where people can come to ask questions or to share their knowledge, and also host some of the infrastructure to support some of the projects that the JavaScript Foundation is going to be running with.
Centralize all the things seems to be the motto at the Linux Foundation, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, and I wonder how JavaScript has done so well without this. Well, what I'm saying is that if it's done this well and it's one of the most popular languages, why is it suddenly needed?
Well, it's clearly not, is it? I mean, it's been pushed along quite happily previously by standards bodies. As Joe says, this is just centralised all the things. My pressure has come to me.
Are we all doing voices this show?
So it would seem.
All right, I'll stop it and talk about a sensible news story then. And we're going to stay with the Linux Foundation. And together with edX, they're rolling out yet another MOOC. We've previously mentioned the first three, which were the Introduction to Linux course, which has now attracted more than 600,000 students from around the world, apparently. The Introduction to Cloud Infrastructure Technologies, and Introduction to OpenStack. And the latest edition is Introduction to DevOps. And like the other courses they've provided, it's going to be free to enroll for.
Now, can I just stop you? What is a MOOC? Because my friend listened to the show and he said, I had no idea what you were talking about. It was all acronyms and I had no idea what they were.
Massively online.
Yep.
Something course. Well, that's close enough. Well, this is good, isn't it? I mean, like most of the introduction to courses from the Linux Foundation, it is essentially a marketing tool to make you buy their other ones. But at least it gives people who are wanting an introduction a chance, rather than having to fork out for something and then realizing, no, this isn't for me. At least you could get halfway through a free course and decide, no thanks. Or you get all the way through it, you're really keen, and then you don't necessarily have to buy it from the Linux Foundation. There are plenty of other places offering similar courses.
Yeah, and providing you do get halfway through it, you'll have done my favourite two topics that I noticed, which were understand, analyse, and map value streams, and explain and implement the deployment pipeline. So it's like buzzword bingo, but I'm sure it'll be of use to somebody.
It is, and a little bit of Googling has told me massive open online course.
Open. There we go. All right, well, let's end the news with, I don't know how to put this really. Is it positive or is it negative? And that's that Linux Voice has joined the Linux New Media family. So Linux Voice magazine is no more, and now it's going to merge with Linux Magazine. So the four guys behind Linux Voice are going to be contributing now to Linux Magazine in their own Linux Voice section, but it's not going to have its own title, which is, well, there's no polite way to put it. They've basically failed, haven't they? We've outlived them, because I remember we announced the start of this on this show, and now we're announcing the end of it. But the positive way to look at it is at least they haven't let down their existing subscribers, because they at least will be getting a magazine, and the guys from Linux Voice will be writing in that magazine.
Yeah, I think failed is a bit harsh. I'm sure there's some more middle ground word we could use, but they've gone for what I think was quite an ambitious goal, to get a old medium magazine out with just 4 of them writing full time, and then other people contributing and putting more into the magazine. It was I can't believe they would produce so much content every month in their magazine. I was really surprised. But as I said, it is an old medium. It is difficult to keep that alive and to keep the money flowing for magazines and things. I mean, I'm a subscriber, but I don't often go to WH Smith's anymore and browse the magazine section. I used to. Maybe it's just a change of age or what have you, but I think they've done really well. They've been going for a couple of years now, and the podcast is very popular and what have you, but it's just difficult to keep the interest in a magazine, I think, in this day and age.
Well, at least they delivered on their original Indiegogo campaign, and they even delivered on their promise to donate some money to various distros and projects. I think £5,000. And it looks like they've managed the transition pretty well. And it looks like they're continuing to do the podcast, which is good news. I spoke to Graham privately not too long ago, and he said that that's the one aspect that's been doing really well consistently. Everyone seems to love the podcast. So I think I speak for all of us in wishing them well. Several months ago, I sent Paddy a Raspberry Pi 2.
Straight in with the low blow.
And he promised to use it, and he never did. So we thought, right, we'll do a segment about it and make him. So, Paddy, first of all, you have turned it on and used it.
I have indeed, yes.
Okay, great. Right. So let's start with, presumably you tried Raspbian or Noobs first?
Okay, let's back up a little bit, shall we? Because I can't be the only person listening to this show that's never actually seen one of these things. I've read an awful lot about them, but I hadn't physically had one in my hand until you sent me this. And it was a Model 2, this one, isn't it?
Yes, 2B.
2B, okay. If you haven't seen one previously, it's a bare PCB with a few bits and bobs soldered on top. And the PCB's almost exactly the same size as a packet of cigarettes. And with the USB ports poking up the top of it, it's just slightly lower than a packet of cigarettes. So you could fit the whole thing inside a packet of JPS. I've tried, and it works.
Can I just say that there's almost no chance that more of the audience will know what a packet of cigarettes looks like versus a Raspberry Pi? At least I hope the kind of people who listen to us.
Oh, society slipped so far now, people don't smoke.
No, it's frowned upon, Paddy, in polite circles.
Yeah, they throw you out of pubs and everything now.
Oh, well, anyway, that's how big it is. Yeah, I did try Raspbian. I thought I wouldn't bother with Noobs, because that appeared to be aimed for people who had no idea whatsoever, and I've got somewhat of an idea with Linux. So I started with Raspbian. But before I could start with Raspbian, I had to go and find an awful lot of cables, and this is one of my big complaints about the actual device, and I think something I'll come back to a bit later on.
But do you see now why, when we've been discussing the Pi Zero and people say how small it is, that I keep on moaning about the fact that you need all these sort of adapters just to bring the ports up to a normal size, and then you need another thing to plug in to get power into it, or, well, power's not a good example, but to get a USB subsequent device, whatever it might be. So while they are very small, smaller than a packet of cigarettes apparently, it does become bigger when you start plugging all these things in.
It does become bigger, yes, and quite cumbersome and cluttery. So you have a power cable. I tried my phone adapter for a start, but that made some rather horrible noises because it was trying to draw too much power from it. So I rapidly swapped over to my Nexus 7 charger instead, which I think throws out an amp as opposed to 500 milliamps. And then obviously you're plugging in a USB keyboard and a USB mouse. And then, it's got no wireless built in. So having to find a USB wireless dongle, and then you realise you can't actually plug that in at the same time as the keyboard and mouse because the dongle's too wide to fit next to them or underneath them. So then you go foraging for a USB-A cable to extend that out, and you end up with a rat's nest of cables, and it's just not a very pleasant working environment.
To be fair with the 3, that has got Wi-Fi, and so that makes it a lot easier to start using, and that is the same price as a 2 now.
But the other thing that I think of that's a problem is that the power comes off of one end, the USBs are on the other end, and the HDMI is off a third side. And so you end up with, if you just put it physically on the floor, you've got cables coming out of 3 sides of it. And so that becomes, you can't just gather them nicely into a small place.
Yeah, it's really badly designed from a cable management point of view, I think. But anyway, once you've got everything plugged in and you've got this rat's nest on the floor, you pop in an SD card underneath, which has got a really nice connector, actually. And I gather that's something that's also been redesigned for the Pi 3 in a backwards way.
Well, to cut costs, basically. That's got the clicky one, isn't it, the 2? Whereas it's just a push and pull, so there's nothing actually holding it in with the 3 and with the 0.
Yeah, I agree. That's a massive backward step. I like the confidence of clicking it in and clicking it out.
Yeah, but if you're going to cut costs somewhere, that seems an obvious place to me.
You mean like how often you actually change the micro SD card?
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough.
And so what do you think of Raspbian then?
Well, I connected it up to my television, which is the only device in this house that's got HDMI ports on it. None of the monitors and things have, because they're so old, which is another issue I had, to be honest, because working in front of a television sat on the floor isn't a great environment. And again, if I was going to be trying to use this for something sensible, I would obviously need an HDMI monitor sat on a desk somewhere. So again, it all gets very confusing. And also because it's connected to the television via an HDMI cable, and I'm using wireless, that posed some problems with some of the distributions I tried, and I would obviously need some extremely long cables to reach directly into my wireless router and to hard cable that up. And it'd be even more of a rat's nest.
Yes, but that's if you wanted to use it as a desktop, which I don't think that is the point of it. Although it is capable of running a desktop, it's not really the main point of it.
Yeah, and that was kind of where I was kicking off. And mentally I had in my head that I would expect this to be a poor user experience as a desktop. But it is something that gets a lot of press in the Linux world, actually running desktop operating systems on this, as opposed to using it for a server or doing little robotic experiments or whatever. So it seemed like a fairly reasonable place for me to start, considering how much people go on about it.
Yeah, I agree, Paddy. If you're going to start using a Raspberry Pi, obviously the first thing you do is download the official distribution and boot it up and look at it. And so that's clearly the starting place. Subsequently, once you've got it running and you have a project in mind or whatever, you start SSHing in, and therefore the number of cables you need goes down dramatically to a power, and if you've got Wi-Fi set up, just a Wi-Fi dongle. So, the use case gets improved significantly, and you can sit at your CRT or whatever it is you've got, Paddy, and play to your heart's content.
Yeah, because my Pi that's running 24/7 now, I have one cable plugged into it, power. I did initially have to plug in other things to set it up and stuff, but now all it needs is power because it's got Wi-Fi built in. And that is, can you see why that was such a big deal, Paddy, when the 3 came out with onboard Wi-Fi and Bluetooth?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And if people are listening to this and shouting at the radio or whatever they're listening to us on, yeah, I am a new user here in this environment, so you're getting a new user's perspective. And if you've been using these devices for the last couple of years, you'll have forgotten all of this. It'll have just become a custom thing that you're used to. But for me, it was a bit of a horrific shock, to be honest. Anyway, dragging it back to Raspbian. Raspbian is fine, actually. When I first booted into it, I was a little curious as to what the lightning flash was on the screen. And that sort of periodically flashed on and off, and it took me a few minutes to twig that was actually the SD card access.
Oh, I haven't noticed that yet. This is presumably part of the new Pixel desktop.
Well, given that I don't know what he's talking about either, I assume it's part of the new Pixel desktop, because I think I would have spotted that in Raspbian at some point. So, do you know if you were using Pixel?
I was, yes, using the latest one. You also had the similar sort of thing in Ubuntu Mate 16.04 as well. It wasn't a lightning flash this time, it was some sort of little square thing. But it's up in the right-hand corner of the screen, and it clearly shows SD card access.
No, it shows that the power supply you're using is not delivering enough power. That's what the rainbow square means. Presumably that rainbow square has changed now in Raspbian to be a lightning flash. And being that I use a beefy 2.4 amp power supply, that's why I've never seen it. It's not documented anywhere, is it?
Well, I didn't see it documented anywhere. I must admit, I had to look around to try and work out what it was, and just came to the conclusion it was SD card access. But there's so much of that going on, perhaps it obviously wasn't.
Yeah, that's what that means, that the Nexus 7 power supply, or possibly the cable that you're using with it, or the combination of those two, is not beefy enough to use the Pi, certainly as a desktop. So my advice, use a shorter cable.
Oh, well, you live and learn, don't you? Back to Raspbian itself. I was expecting something really horrific based on the description I heard from you two, particularly you, Joe. And I have to say, it's perfectly serviceable, reasonably attractive desktop. I know you made a big thing about the icons, that they'd been revamped and looked a bit sort of 1980s or something. I thought they were actually okay. It's got a nice little control widgety thing built in that allows you to adjust various settings and overclock it and do things like that, which you need to do to actually set the date and time using the correct time zone. For whatever reason, it didn't pick it up automatically from the network.
To be fair, I said that it used to be sort of early 90s and now it's kind of late 90s, the look of it.
I don't know, actually. They seem reasonably apt to me. After I tried Raspbian, which ran quite happily, I tried Ubuntu Martin, and the flashiness of that, if you like, seemed totally out of place with the device it was running on. And it kind of brought to mind, sort of about 30 years ago, I was working for a company, and they gave me a company car, and it was a white 205, which was quite a nice little thing, but they would try to make it more impressive for our customers by putting on wide wheel arches and a great big whale fin on the back, so it looked like a GTI. And it didn't. It just looked daft, and it looked overblown for what it actually was. And I have to say that's kind of what the feeling I got using Ubuntu Martin on the Pi. The Pi is a pretty unpretentious utilitarian sort of piece of hardware, and I feel that the actual look and feel of Raspbian goes along with that. It's not trying to be like a super slick desktop, whereas the Mate desktop on top, which does look slick, is out of place, and it becomes even more noticeable how slow everything is because your expectations are raised by the fact the desktop looks nice.
That is a very interesting perspective, and I don't know if I agree with it entirely. I can see your point totally, but at the same time, the majority of the people using the Pi have never used Linux before. And so their first experience of Linux is this utilitarian, stripped back LXDE theme. And even with this Pixel update, it's still fairly utilitarian. And so they just assume that Linux is only good for these little devices that are not very powerful, and therefore it's not going to be a viable desktop on their main PC or laptop.
Yeah, but if this is their first experience of Linux and it's Ubuntu Martin, they're still not going to think it's going to be a viable operating system for their desktop or laptop because they're going to think, God, this is slow and dreadful to use.
Yeah, fair point, I suppose.
Anyway, I couldn't really try out Ubuntu very much because, unlike Raspbian, it refused to actually talk to my network card particularly happily. It would actually connect to the network and then drop after 2 or 3 seconds, whereas Raspbian was rock solid. And no, I haven't reported a bug because I've got no idea what's going on there. But out of those two, say Raspbian I used quite happily and seemed okay. Jesse mentioned SSHing earlier. I sort of wandered through into the other room and sort of an mmap later found out what my IP address was and SSH'd in. I mean, that's one thing I would actually like to see in the GUI for Raspbian is somewhere that just actually mentions what your IP address is, so you don't have to either drop down to a terminal or come and do an mmap like I did. It seems like a bit of a strange mishmash, Raspbian, of sort of trying to make things easy for a newbie and also exposing an awful lot of things for an advanced user. it doesn't seem to be able to make its mind up which it is really.
Well, that's because that is exactly what it is for. It is for people who are brand new to it, and it is also for people who are very advanced. So I think that by definition, it has to be that mishmash.
I should have maybe butted in earlier and made this point, but where you're saying, Joe, this is the first time that people are seeing Linux and they're therefore getting a bit of a bad view of it, and you're not happy with how Raspbian looks with Pixel. I wonder how many of those people are actually aware that it's Linux and just associate this slightly quirky kind of oldish, childish kind of interface with the Raspberry Pi, and that's what the Raspberry Pi runs. It's Raspbian, it's not Linux. And so, I would therefore go on to Paddy's view, whereby if it's the first time that you've run it and you associate that with the Raspberry Pi, you maybe aren't giving Linux a bad name, you're just making the interface for the Raspberry Pi be more Raspberry Pi-like, as Paddy was trying to point out.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable point. I just think it's a shame that you've got, I keep banging on about this over and over again, but you've got 10 million of these devices sold. Okay, even if 5 million are in a drawer and the other 5 million people have got more than one, that's still at least several 100,000 people, if not millions of people, who are using Linux. And even if they don't know about it, it's a shame, because it would be nice for them to see the potential that Linux has on this tiny, cheap bit of hardware, and how it would compare on a proper x86 laptop instead of dreadful Windows 10.
Yeah, it's a missed opportunity there. I see what you're saying. But given that we all say that Mate is a very light desktop environment, and therefore Ubuntu Mate would be a prime example for what you should use on the Pi if you're going to be using a Linux distribution at all. Yet Paddy's saying that it isn't that great. Or was your point, Paddy, more that it was sort of a bad fit for the little device, rather than it was a lot slower to use?
It wasn't drastically slower than Raspbian, what I could actually see. I think any X-based desktop on a Pi, just from looking at those two, is going to be pretty sluggish, to be honest. And I've got some old hardware in this house. I can't directly compare it to any of the other boxes that are kicking around here, but it is not a pleasant experience. I mean, it's usable, but it's not pleasant. But yeah, I think, as I said earlier, that a slightly rougher looking utilitarian desktop is more in keeping with what the actual device is. I mean, I was thinking about this and thinking back to a show we did before you actually joined us, Jesse, when Joe and I were talking about the Unix Haters Handbook. And I can remember making an analogy during that conversation to the fact that Linux is a Land Rover or a Jeep for the American audience. And it can quite happily drive on the road or across muddy fields and carry things and do a whole host of tasks for you. None of them particularly well, or certainly not better than vehicles designed specifically for a certain task. So it won't go around a racetrack faster than an F1 car, for instance, but it'll do them all fairly competently. And I get the feeling that's probably what I would have liked to see the Pi doing. But I also get the feeling it probably isn't. And rather than being sort of this utilitarian thing that could be pushed into any sort of use case, it really is sort of a jack of all trades, master of none, sort of neither fish nor fowl. And it can't make its mind up whether it is meant to be like a really cheap teaching device that sits in the classroom and people use as a desktop, or whether it is a robotics platform, or whether it is a server sat in someone's cupboard. The limited exposure I've had so far suggests to me it's not actually succeeding at any of those use cases, because it's trying to do all of them, and it's doing all of them reasonably badly.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious use for me and what I'm using it for personally is as a server, but even the 3 with Wi-Fi, it does have this issue of I/O, basically, in that everything is through the USB bus, and so it's limited speed. I mean, with the Pi 3, I can get about 50 or 60 megabits a second tops, in or out, not both at the same time. regardless of whether that is Wi-Fi or Ethernet. And so really, as a server on your LAN, it's not that useful, because if you get even a fairly cheap x86 box with gigabit Ethernet, then it's just instantly orders of magnitude better as a server. I mean, Jesse, you have got experience. You've got a server running in your cupboard. I believe that's got gigabit Ethernet. I mean, even if it's got 100 megabit, that's still significantly faster. Could you see yourself replacing it with a Pi?
Well, straight out, no, because of the things that I run on my server. I doubt you're using that as a server which is showing, content, media content. It's not having loads of big files pushed backwards and forwards. I guess your one is doing small amounts of stuff now and then. But, I've got Plex on mine, and that is a huge load on any CPU, so it has to be fast enough for that. Now, if you take that off and you look at the other things that I have on my server, these services that I said that didn't start up, things like C-File, a torrent client, these sorts of things, I could see it plodding along fairly okay without too much problem. I put down the slowness mostly to the speed of the CPU. Whenever I SSH in and issue commands and things, or ask to transfer files or backups and things, I always just assume it's the CPU maxing out rather than the I/O speed.
Well, I think it's a bit of both, isn't it? But what I'm talking about is doing file transfers and stuff. That's when you really notice it. But the thing in its favor for me, and the reason that I am using it as opposed to one of my many, many x86 boxes, is that it uses virtually no power. And that's the attractive part about it. I've got a server running that is it's just sipping tiny amounts of power through a phone charger.
Yeah, we obviously come at this from very different mindsets, because in the only case that I've ever given you a piece of hardware, as opposed to the number of times I've taken hardware off you, I gave you that big, 20-port switch.
Yeah,
and it's never been used because of the power it takes, which is a perfectly viable reason. If you don't need 20 ports or 10 ports, whatever, there's no point in plugging it in and upping your electricity bill.
Yeah, I mean, this thing's 100 watts. I'm not going to be running that all the time, quite frankly, whereas the Pi is 2 or 3.
Exactly. However, in my sort of little server cupboardy thing where I've got the Wi-Fi and the Tado and my server and my NAS and a couple of other bits and devices in there, it is dwarfed in power by all the other things. So to me, it's just another item that you need to have them all plugged in, because a simple 4 ports on the back of a router is never going to suffice for the myriad of things that I'm plugging into it. So it's use cases. And for that, I entirely agree that the low power usage of the Pi, if that's all you've got running, is a really, really beneficial thing. Where I make the most of that is when I try and take sort of time-lapse boxes out into fields and into sort of portable areas. The fact that it can run off of a USB like brick that you normally charge your phone with, okay, I get the biggest one possible to get the most amount of power out of it for the time, but it just sips away at that, like you're saying, is a really, really useful feature for that you can't get with any other device.
Well, not necessarily no other devices, and you've got Odroids and various other single-board computers in this space, but certainly not with mainstream appeal and massive communities and loads of software available. And that's why the Pi is attracted to me, even though I could replace it with something that is more suited to the task. It's not necessarily going to have the support that a Raspberry Pi has.
Yeah, and you'd have to learn that. So you make a very good point about there are loads of other devices, and I was thinking of just a laptop or a normal PC. But you're right, there are all these other single-board computers that you can use. But I know how Linux works. I know how the Raspberry Pis work. I understand their setup, all these sorts of things. And while there may well be a way in which I could get a BeagleBone or an Arduino or something to do exactly what I want with half the power, or however they work, I'd have to go through the rigmarole of buying one and learning it, and it isn't running Linux that I know, and all these sorts of things. It just means that the Raspberry Pi, for me as someone who has some knowledge of some basic knowledge of Linux, it makes it an open door for me. So,
well, to be fair, most of those other single-board computers do run some sort of Linux. Some are Debian and some various other distros. So it wouldn't be a huge leap. And I'm sure I would be fine with them. But the fact is that because there have been so many of these Raspberry Pis sold, I think it's more likely that, for example, the Ubuntu version, I've got Ubuntu 16.04 running. I actually installed Lubuntu. I haven't really used the GUI at all. I could have easily just gone for a totally headless. But I know, or at least I think, that is going to be supported for quite a long time. Whereas these sort of custom distros that you get with custom kernels and stuff like that for the other single-board computers, I'm not as confident that I'm going to be able to use that board for the long term. So, I mean, that brings me back to you, Paddy. Now that you've had a quick play around with it, or probably an extended, very in-depth play around with it, knowing you, can you see yourself actually using this thing, for example, as a server?
Not totally sure on the server side of things. To take it back a step, I certainly won't be using it as a desktop in any way, shape or form. Just for completeness sake, I did try RISC OS as well.
I was going to ask you about that. That is incredible, isn't it, how fast that is?
Yeah, it is. And that shows you quite clearly how fat and slow and ugly the Linux stack is.
But there's no applications for it.
But there's no applications for it, and wireless drivers don't exist and all the rest of it. So it's a totally impractical desktop to actually use. The thing that I'm interested in sort of exploring with this is some of the programming down there in the metal, to be honest. And I've had a look to see if I can get a USB to TCL cable so I can actually connect it directly. And there are a couple of projects caught my eye. There was the Altibo thing, which I mentioned to you guys, and we were talking before recording one day, which is a free Pascal implementation and kind of creates unikernels. So you can actually write a nice bit of Pascal, and it's obviously Ball and variant, which is a good language, and I like very much. And then compiled down into a kernel, which you just plonk on it, and it runs on the hardware fundamentally. And I also found a fourth version, and again, I like fourth very much. I think it's a splendid language, and I'd quite like to be playing with that, which is why I was looking at the serial cable. So that's kind of the stuff I'm more likely to go for, because I've not got any great interest in home automation or any of that sort of stuff, which I know Jesse gets into with it.
Well, I think you've perfectly summarised how it's become so popular because of the variability of what you can do with it. You know, I don't think Joe has mentioned any of those particular use cases to me before. I've not sort of read much about them, but actually knowing you, probably quite a lot of research. But I was going to say, in not a lot of research, you can find all these outlets and things you can do with it. So it'd be fascinating to hear how those things go on when you eventually get round to playing around. Because if you're anything like me, you have some grand plans and they never quite come to fruition until like 6 months, a year down the line when you find yourself with a wet weekend to play with it.
Yeah, I'm certainly interested in trying a few different things out, and I'll come back and report on a future show. It is also interesting how we have got different takes on this because of what we're wanting to do with the device. And I'm very curious to find out whether my suggestion that perhaps it is a jack of all trades and master of none turns out to be true or not, or whether it simply is the case that desktop use case is one it's not well suited for, even though it's the one that gets the most amount of press.
Well, if you're going to tell us what you did with yours, obviously Joe and I'll have to also contribute and explain how we use our Raspberry Pis.
Yeah, no doubt we'll come back to this in a future show. On to the feedback then. And first of all, a huge thanks to our new monthly supporter, Jerry Murphy. Very much appreciated. And of course, to our existing monthly supporters. Help us keep the lights on and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jerry. It is massively appreciated. And everybody else who helps us going on a monthly basis. Last time out, Joe did a little plug for DigitalOcean. And immediately following the release of that show, somebody tweeted us and sort of said, congratulations on getting a sponsorship deal. And we just wanted to point out we haven't got a sponsorship deal with DigitalOcean. And the only reason that we're happy to plug them like that is because we genuinely think they're a good service.
Yeah, so if you want to check them out, linuxluddites.com/DigitalOcean. And contact details then. So you can email us show@linuxluddites.com. Or if you look on the website, you'll find links to the Twitter and Google Plus and Facebook communities, or you can always leave a comment on the website.
Yeah, and onto the feedback. So Cubicle Nick got in touch and said, Google will do what Google wants to do, but I find it increasingly aggravating when you get used to an application or service only to have it ripped out from under you. This has made me increasingly hesitant to try something new. Maybe I'm becoming a somewhat grumpy Luddite myself. That said, I am slow to accept anything that isn't open source or something that I can't own a copy of because of the circumstance where the service goes away that backs it. I still buy DVDs and the occasional VHS from a thrift shop, and I always buy real books. Excuse me while I sit on my front porch and yell at the kids to get off my lawn. And apart from his point about VHSs, which are absolutely dead, and even charity shops around here don't even take them anymore, I agree with his point. I'm trying to experiment, if a little bit slowly, to move off of Google Drive and off of Dropbox, because then I'm at least sort of, self-supporting, and the idea that if those things go away, while I know Dropbox only has one feather in its bow and therefore it must
string to its bow, feather in its cap, but let's move on.
Okay, fine. So bows and hats and feathers and things. And therefore that's unlikely to go away. Whereas Google, they do only have one drive. I mean, it's not like with their messaging apps where they have multiple ones, and whichever one you put your money into is likely to go away. It's you're going to pick one, and you're going to be the unfortunate person that they then drop support for that messaging app because there's a whole load of them at the moment. But I think Google Drive is likely to stay around. However, you can't guarantee it with Google, and this is the sort of the point that CubicleNet is making. And so I am trying to slowly sort of bring stuff in-house that I have control over.
Yeah, and Rob Landley followed up with, speaking of abandoned Google products, it's a pity the Google graveyard isn't updated regularly. There are follow-up articles, but no central place collecting them like that, which is kept up to date. And he put a couple of links there, so do check out the show notes for 89. And it's interesting, I was thinking about a Google product, and I can't even remember what it was called now. It was where if you're an expert in something, you signed up for it, and then people would pay you for a bit of your time on Hangouts to solve their problems. Like if you fix computers or whatever, you could talk them through, that kind of thing. And I can't remember what that was called, but I seem to remember having a vague interest in it and then getting an email to say they were shutting it down a few months later. But I think you're right, Jesse, about Drive. I think your basic Office stuff is fairly safe, touch wood, Gmail, Drive, and Docs and that kind of thing. But other than that, and Android, I'm not convinced that anything is really safe.
I think Android's probably stretching it a bit, to be honest. Certainly if you think about things from a free and open source aspect.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the idea that Android will go almost completely proprietary is certainly very real, but I think that it will still exist. Although you might get some horrible mashup with that and Chrome OS, and it might end up being rebranded like they've rebranded the Nexus is. Or is it Nexi?
Yeah. You and punctuation and pluralisms is, we'll just put that to one side. I'll be here all day. Let me take Ian Barton's note about wrong pseudo password delays, which is sort of a question that I posed at the start of the last show. And Ian Barton says, in reference to why there's a delay, he says, I think this is probably because authentication is usually set up to try various network protocols in addition to /s/password, e.g. LDAP. So if you mistype the password, Linux tries to go off and authenticate you against all the various remote options that are configured. In effect, you're waiting for network timeout before authentication finally decides you have typed the wrong password.
Yeah, and Ian gave us a link to an article on linuxgeek.net that sort of covered an awful lot of the PAM stuff. I don't think Ian's on the right track here, though, to be honest, because I had a look in how PAM was configured on my desktop, certainly, and PAM fail delay is sat there with a delay configured as 3 seconds. And I suspect an awful lot of other people listening will have exactly the same configuration because some Googling showed that's a fairly common setup on an awful lot of distros. So I think it's actually built in there, and all you have to do is go and change to the file that's in, etc., pam.d/login, and just take that line and modify it to your heart's desire.
Right, I know exactly what I'm doing on my server after this show then.
But isn't that a bad idea from a security point of view? Because as we talked about last time when you brought this up, Jesse, if you've got 3 seconds between attempts, then brute forcing it is incredibly difficult. If you put that down to 1 microsecond, it means that it's just going to get hammered potentially.
Well, hopefully you'd have something else sat in front of that, wouldn't you? So that if a single IP was repeatedly connecting, you'd be banning it, and you shouldn't be using passwords to log in remotely anyway, for goodness sake. You should be using some sort of PKI infrastructure.
That is absolutely perfect. It's a great answer. That means that not only can I reduce my delay to 3 milliseconds, I also have to build myself some sort of firewall which sees all the incoming traffic and therefore blocks it. Perfect. Thank you very much.
This is why I don't open my ports. Anyway, James Lewis got in touch about Unity. He said, I think you may have sold the Unity 8 preview a bit short. There are not many apps specifically for Unity 8, it's true, but ultimately access to Mir will be via the toolkits, as it will be for Wayland. That is, the apps need to be decoupled from X such that they do all work via the toolkit, and then they will work on either. I'm pretty dubious about how or when this will be achieved with either Wayland or Mir, but in principle, if something works on Wayland, then it should work on Mir given compatible backends for the toolkits. However, what I think you missed is that the demo session of Unity 8 in 1610 does have the ability to run X applications. They run from a container. This makes it a lot more capable than it might be at first glance. And then he gives a link to an OMG Ubuntu article about it. And I have to admit, I didn't get far enough to try that. But I have tried that on the phone before. I remember, actually it was on the Nexus 7, wasn't it? We were trying to get the Xmir apps running, and it works with some degree of success. But for me, that's just a stopgap, isn't it? It's like using Wine when you first move over, or dual booting or whatever. Really, we need to get these applications working with the toolkits, and so that we can just get rid of X completely. But it does seem a long way away.
It is unfortunate that Unity 8 seems so far away. I mean, as you said there, this is a sort of a bit of a bodge to get normal applications working that everyone's used to, working on Unity 8. But like you say, it does feel like to have this means that we're still a long way from getting some sort of next generation that entirely reduces the need for X. So we'll see whether or not it's ready for the next LTS, I guess.
Well, rounding things off then, Russell Dickinson got in touch and said, thanks for covering Phoenix OS. It seems you came to many of the same conclusions as I did when I tried it. I've had to move on to alternatives given the absence of the Play Store, but if that was available, I'd probably be using it.
So I'm interested to know what Russell is using now. I get the implication that he's tried that and moved on to something else and has either settled with that or is still moving around the various options that are there. So do get back in touch, Russell, and let us know what you've tried that has the Play Store, that has the various functionalities of Phoenix OS as well.
And I guess the implication from Russell's comment there is also that it's running on a tablet, because that was where you hit the problem with no Play Store, whereas me running it on a desktop, I found it there quite happily.
Yeah, it must have been. Although I did get a tweet from Marius Quarbeck, personally to me, who said that he has found a GApps version that you can install in Phoenix OS, but that he prefers Remix OS. So I'm not sure about that. He didn't tell me what it was, and I forgot to ask. So I wouldn't mind knowing if that is indeed true and whether you can run Google Apps, because that would make it a lot more usable to me. Because without them, I know there's going to be freedom lovers out there like Phelim who doesn't use Google Apps, but Android needs it as far as I'm concerned, or I'm addicted to Google. What can I say?
Did we ever find out what the license arrangements were for Phoenix?
I don't think we did. I think it's just sort of they don't care about licenses like most people on GitHub, which unfortunately means it's proprietary by default. But that'll do it for the feedback then. Let's move on.
Last show, Joe and Jesse were quite enthusiastic about Plasma 5.8, a mere 20 years after the first KDE release. Now, I don't really want to pick on KDE in particular, but that got me thinking about a couple of related issues. Firstly, should we judge projects like KDE a success, or totally and utterly abject failures? And secondly, what to make a laughable claim of many who sort of fashion themselves as software engineers, when in reality they're just code monkeys or project monkeys. that probably sounds a bit harsh, but think about it from a proper engineering perspective. If you claim to be an engineer, and you are an engineer, Jesse, and say you've got a ravine you want to build a bridge over. You've got a definite problem there that needs solving. You've got some known materials and constraints to work within. You make a design, someone goes and builds it to spec, it works, and it's done. And there's a very small amount of ongoing maintenance to do, things like painting, just to stop it falling to pieces and rusting and what have you. But it basically does what it was designed to do, and it will carry on doing what it's designed to do for its lifetime. And software's not like that. But we claim it's an engineering discipline.
Okay, I'll take the analogy. I understand that you're saying that basically people who write software like to keep on rewriting it. And you've pointed out the fact that KDE started 2 decades ago, and we've had various changes to it, and they keep on having major releases. So, 3, 4, now on to 5. Similarly with GNOME, everyone was happy. Well, a lot of people say that GNOME 2 was a perfectly good desktop environment, and now I've got GNOME 3, and there was a whole problem with the move. And now I, as one, use GNOME, and so people are happy with it. But with your analogy, I think perhaps is a ravine an unfair just analogy, because it is fixed and never changing. Whereas the software world, the hardware that the software has to run on, the bugs that come along, the new equipment, all these things that are variables, mean that you don't start with a ravine, you start with jelly, and it can move around. And while your bridge may well work in the first time, the ravine will change shape and size, and so you have to adapt with it.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that, certainly from the hardware perspective. And I think it's something that anyone who's been in the industry for a period of time will recognise sort of straight out of the box, is that the hardware industry and the software industry work sort of hand in glove to keep things never standing still. There's always movement there, which forces you to upgrade, spend more money on hardware, and obviously contribute wonderfully to the problem we have with disposal of toxic waste and all the rest of it. And buying new bits of software to run on this new kit, because the kit's changed out from underneath the actual code base in the first place. So, yeah, I take your point on board totally, but I'd see it more as a scam than actually an attempt to solve a problem. I mean, software is there as a tool, or it should be there as a tool. People write it fine as a hobby, and that's all well and good. But companies selling us software, and a lot of the open source software we use, is supposed to be a tool to actually achieve some other purpose. It's not an end in itself. And constant change, which implies user training and all the rest of it, and shelling out to acquire it, isn't really in the benefit of the end user. And it's the end user I'm thinking about here. The industry is very happy with the current state of affairs because it keeps everybody in jobs, from devs to journalists, what have you. But it isn't really helping the end user.
We obviously have to pick that apart and get into details or various views on how that is. But just so we have an understanding, or so that I have an understanding of where we're starting from, can you just explain what you see as the difference between a developer and a maintainer? I only ask because it occurred to me that, a developer, it has this sort of, well, I think maybe the point you're making is that they have this sort of view that they have to keep on making new products and rejuvenating products, whereas a maintainer, in theory, once that bridge has been built, you go from being a developer to being a maintainer, and you just do, as you said, the painting and the upkeep to ensure that it doesn't fall down, or if there is a bug in some part of the system that you're using. I mean, Joe's going to kill me for my analogies because you started it, is what I'm saying, Paddy. If you find out those bolts that you've used only have a 20-year life and your bridge has to have a 50-year life, you go and change the bolts. But that's a maintenance point, not a development point. So I'm just want it clear in my head how you see the different roles.
Yeah, I think you've drawn it out quite well there, to be honest. I mean, maintenance is an ongoing thing, and everything requires maintenance. Your house requires painting and the guttering, fixing, and what have you. And software is the same. You will find bugs. Eventually, they'll sort of mostly get ironed out over a period of time, as we were discussing back in the news. As long as you're not changing anything else, things will get better over time or they'll stay the same. Maintenance is seriously underrated in our society, and it's the maintainers in society that largely keep things running, from the people sort of cleaning the streets to pushing beds around in hospitals or whatever. Maintenance is not valued as much as creating new shiny stuff, and I think it's one of the big problems we have in wider society, never mind about within the computing world. And devs are very flighty creatures. They like working on new and shiny things, and it pays to be working on new and shiny things. And it tends to be the sort of slightly lumpen people left doing maintenance, unfortunately.
What about innovation?
Yeah, what about innovation? Show me innovation.
Innovation may well be Unity 8. I mean, we're getting there.
Oh, come on. It's exactly the same as X. It might be slightly different, but it's providing the same facilities. It's not innovative. The last innovation I can think of in the IT industry is mobile telephony. That's the last one. And how long have iPhones been around?
And indeed the phones before iPhones. Yeah, it's been an awfully long time. What about smartwatches, IoT?
Yeah, and the fact you can laugh about it shows I'm right, doesn't it?
Yeah, I suppose so. So Jesse wanted to know the difference that in your mind, Paddy, between maintainers and developers. What about the difference between software engineers and code monkeys, as you put it? Where do you draw that line?
I think engineering, as I suggested earlier, is about working with known materials with recognizable properties that you can combine in various ways and actually produce a product that you understand and within timescales that you can plan for in advance and at costs that you can organize in advance. And that is something that rarely happens in the software world. I mean, it does happen on big projects. I'm well aware of that. But a lot of the code in the FOSS world just organically evolves and isn't actually planned. And I think planning comes into this in a big way. And it's something we loathe in the FOSS world. We don't like the idea of someone being in control and actually laying stuff out and saying this is the scheme we're working to. And I mean, there are logistical problems as well. And we've talked about this before, when you've got contributors all over the world and what have you. They're not insurmountable difficulties. But what I'm kind of suggesting is that people recognize these as problems, but they're problems they're very happy to have because it keeps the status quo intact. It keeps everybody in work, and of course, everybody likes getting paid. As I say, it doesn't help the end user. It doesn't develop a product that is there at the end of the day. It's done, and people know they can carry on using it for the next 10 years without being pulled out from underneath them. So it's working in everybody's interests apart from the consumer.
But I still have to think that there are things that are happening in the world, or, you know, I don't mean in the world from a political sense or whatever, but in the software world, that mean that you have to keep up and things do have to change. If I don't remember GNOME before it was GNOME 2, but if GNOME 2 was still around, it would be a case of eventually that wouldn't be fit for purpose, and therefore someone would have to come along in a decade and say, look, the way that we use our phones needs to interact with our PCs. For example, the phone I think is a hugely disruptive proposition at the moment, and the way that it doesn't currently interact with our PCs is a problem. But if someone said, look, the way that GNOME 2 is built, the stack is not able to use the way to interact with phones properly, it will be better if we just start from the ground up, or take 20% of the code base and build a whole load on top of that. You have to at some point accept that you need to start from scratch and build something new when something disruptive comes along, or a huge change does come along.
Yeah, I could take that on board if it was a majorly disruptive thing. I mean, harking back to construction industries, for instance, I mean, you've got bricks and breeze blocks and steel joists and all the rest of it. And these have been around for quite a long time, and fine, things like steel joists probably were disruptive when they first appeared. But they've been in use for a long time now. And whether you're building a house or an office block or what have you, you don't think, oh, I suddenly need to ditch all of those materials and find some new materials. And the equivalent in the software world is we are changing toolkits on a regular basis. It's particularly prevalent, obviously, in the web world, although we've been talking about desktops just now. And things get thrown out and new things replace them that people don't understand. So there's all this training thing, all the existing knowledge and skills go out the window. But it's fun. It's great fun for people to play with. But does it actually help you produce a product is, I guess, what I'm saying. And the other thing I'd sort of think about by way of a disruptive analogy is in our software world, we're increasingly building complex interdependent stacks. And that isn't how you do construction, for instance. You have bricks as discrete objects that you can put together in many different ways to create different sorts of structures, and the same with breeze blocks and steel joists and anything else you can think of. And that's really sort of the Unix philosophy, if you like, where you've got all these little things you can bolt together in different ways and create things. And if you've got a loosely coupled stack like that, it's relatively straightforward to add bits to it or swap bits out to end up with something that you desire to have at the end of the day. And we seem to be getting away from that at the moment and exacerbating the problem I'm talking about.
Not a big fan of System D then.
So it sounds like, Paddy, what you're arguing for is the design and manufacture, I suppose, of software, for example, an operating system, that then essentially never adds any features or changes any features, just gets worked on in terms of bugs and stability and just remains rock solid and gets security updates and all the rest of it, but essentially just stays the same.
Yeah, I'm not arguing for something to be put in aspic, though. I mean, if you buy a house, you might build an extension to it, but most people don't. But you will have to end up painting the outside, doing the guttering, what have you. But you are likely to go around and decorate the rooms once in a while, or change what cushions you have and throws and such like. And I guess an operating system is very much like that. The house is the operating system. The basic underlying structure doesn't change and needs to be solid, so you can rely on it so it doesn't blow down every time it gets windy or leak or whatever, every time it rains. But fine, you can change the decor a bit. You can use a different browser or something, for instance, on top, as long as the fundamentals, the underlying bits stay the same. And you, as a consumer, get more value from that because you understand how it works. You don't need retraining every 5 minutes. If it's just the odd application that's changing on top because of changing circumstances, that's fine.
But what about, let's really, really labour this analogy of houses then. If you had a house that was built in the 50s or 60s, that was before things like double glazing. It might have even been before central heating, and things that are potentially major works required to bring it up to modern standards.
Yeah, but they aren't really major works, are they? I mean, I'll take your point. I can see where you're going. I am sat in a house that was built at that era that now has double glazing, so we got it changed out a few years back, and there's also bits of the central heating system extended and a new boiler and what have you. If this was a software house, the way I've gone about it is to get a JCB in and knock the damn thing down, build another house with double glazing already part of the actual design and with the uprated heating system. That's not what people do in the real world.
Not in this country, but if you look at a country like Germany, a superior country, very few of their buildings have any age at all because that's what they do there. They basically just knock them down and start again because you ultimately get a better result. Because rather than just trying to patch it and change it, it's never going to be quite as good as if you knock it down and rebuild it to modern standards.
If you're saying they have no buildings standing that are older than 50 years old, I don't think they knock them down themselves.
No, I'm not saying no. I'm saying that there isn't this sentimentality in Germany for old buildings with character. And clearly there are some very, very old buildings, churches and things like that there. But if you look at a standard house there, the chances are it's not going to be, in London, for example, you can easily see a 100-year-old house that people are still living in. Whereas in Germany, that's much less common, at least in my experience of the bits that I've seen of Germany. And what I'm saying to you is that, yes, you can patch it together, but at some point you have to draw the line and knock it down and start again. Otherwise, it's just not going to be as good as a modern house.
Yeah, absolutely. And things do change over time. And the bridge analogy I started with, that bridge, no matter how well it's maintained, over time will decay, and in 50 years' time it will need replacement. But that's not a reason to replace it every 2 to 3 years.
Except that the technology of bridge building doesn't move as quickly as the technology in the IT world.
Yeah, which I guess is half the point I'm trying to make here, because technology in the IT world doesn't move very fast either. People invent new toolkits and widgets and doodads just to have new shiny technology in air quotes to play with. Underlying all of it, nothing much has changed really.
I do have to say, as we come towards the end of this, that Paddy made a really solid argument, because I also am stood recording this in a 1940s, 1950s building which has double glazing and central heating retrofitted. And I can't believe that Germany goes around bulldozing houses left, right and centre every 20 years. And it would be good if there were just fewer different technologies doing the same thing, because what you get then is when you have multiple technologies doing the same thing in the software world, more technologies come along that fill even smaller niches. But how many times have we heard that when there's a really old bit of technology, sort of software, that has been there for so long, it becomes refined or perfected to a particular task, because people have the time and the knowledge base with which to perfect that task. Okay, so maybe the task is new and the software is old, but they have the knowledge, they have all this background information, and they can hone it to be really slick on this bit of light hardware or really elegant on that bit of high power hardware. And so I think, I see where Paddy's coming from when it comes to the argument for having fewer bits of software, doing fewer things and churning, more often.
Well, no doubt the listeners will have lots to say on this, so do get in touch. But with that, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, or find us on Twitter, Linux Luddites, or the Google Plus and Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks with more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, true anniversary.
See you later.